What I plan to do is divide it into two parts, because I think 20 minutes, 25 minutes is probably plenty of listening. And then we can have a little bit of discussion halfway through, and then I have a little bit more material to present. So I'm going to talk about approaches to studying organizational phenomena processually, and the big wave on your screen is intended to imply process. Flowing water really sort of gives that image. What we're going to be talking about is different ways of considering process in organizational research. So what is process theorizing and process research? So process theorizing implies thinking of phenomena as in motion, as unfolding over time, and as becoming. And what process researchers seek to do is to explain and understand the world in terms of interlinked events, activity, temporality, and flow, rather than in terms of variance and relationships among variables, which is kind of the standard approach to research that we're all familiar with. But a process researcher would focus more on events evolving over time. And that definition comes from a paper by several of us. It was a special issue on process in Academy of Management Journal. So why is all this important? So I have 4 reasons why I think doing process research is important. First of all, the centrality of time to our experience of the world and our understanding of it. It's amazing when you think about it, how many studies that look at the relationship between dependent and independent variables just take time out of the equation. As if it wasn't even there. And yet, time is the one thing in the world that we can't avoid. But very often it's missing from theoretical models. This, from my perspective, is a big problem. Second reason to look at process is to appreciate the multiplicity and temporality of consequences. So when you're thinking about independent and dependent variables, like a dependent variable like performance, you're kind of stopping the clock. It's as if things happen and then there was an effect. But we all know that effects spread out over time. There are short-term effects, there are long-term effects, there are rippling effects. And a process perspective helps you, it allows you to see these short-term and long-term effects over time. A third reason is that it's actually quite important to understand how to move from A to B if you want to improve your organization. So I'm going to give you an example in a moment of what can happen when all you do is you compare 2 situations and you see that A is better than B or B is better than A. And then you're left with the question, well, how do I move from B to A? If A is better, I should do that movement. Much research tends to forget that. And then a final reason to be interested in process is that even when it seems as though nothing much has changed, there's an awful lot of process, of activity that goes into staying the same. So even in situations of stability, we need to understand how we maintain things in organizational life. How do we maintain an organization in a similar state from one day to the next? It requires effort. It requires people to do things. And so process is everywhere, even when things don't change a whole lot. So there are 4 reasons why I think process research is important. I have a little example of the third one, which I think is really revealing. And this is a real example. So I was doing a study of the Alberta, it's a province in Canada, healthcare reform. And in one of their reports, They were talking about taking a series of autonomous organizations and merging them. And the theory was that you would take these autonomous organizations, which were kind of like silos, and you would merge them to create an integrated system, which is the wall that's there. So everything would be better. And at the same time, you would take out all the waste and duplication. So that's that little tower of gray blocks that you can see there that get removed from the wall. And so not only would everything be smoother and integrated, but it would also cost less. And this image was presented in a report. This is what the experts projected. So what's missing? What's missing is how you get from those three towers to that integrated system. There's only one way to do that. You have to take the towers down and rebuild them. And so this is what the experts forgot, that in order to move from autonomous organizations to an integrated system, you need to destroy the towers, you need to rebuild them, and there's a whole process that goes on in between that. So we all know that when you merge two organizations, there's a lot of destruction that has to take place in order to make those two organizations work together as one. And all these talks about synergy, about all the synergy you're going to get from merging, may not take into account the process of actually achieving that. And that process in itself can be costly. So this is another example of why process thinking is important. So given that, how do we engage with process thinking? And so what I'm going to talk about today, and this is going to be the center of my presentation, and this is kind of like the key slide. So once we've talked about this slide, the whole message is in microcosm is in this slide. So I argue that there are 4 ontologically different perspectives on process research and theorizing, and that each one involves different kinds of methods that we need to think about, and has different implications. So the first one is process as evolution, and this focuses essentially on how something changes or evolves over time. It's the kind of process research that we are most familiar with, and it adopts what we call a substantive ontology, in the sense that things are supposed to exist, they just change over time. And so that's what the process as evolution perspective focuses on. The second one is process as narrative, and it adopts a kind of experiential ontology. So here we're not necessarily interested in how something changes in the real world, and I put that in inverted commas, but how people make sense through narrative. So the process, the change over time, is in the stories that people tell, not necessarily partly, maybe partly not, reflected in concrete events in the real world. So that's a second kind of approach. A third approach, I call it process as activity, which takes a becoming ontology. And here the idea is that all is process, and that phenomena, in fact, are constituted by processes. So instead of looking, as in process as evolution, about how an organization changes, we would look at the processes that make an organization. The organization is constituted by processes, by the things that people do every day. And so it kind of turns the notion of process on its head a bit. And then the fourth approach, which I call process as withness, adopts a pragmatist ontology. And here the idea is that not only is the world changing and we're studying the world as it changes, but we are also part of that world at the same time. So the researcher is not outside the processes they are studying. They cannot be. They are going forward with them. And so it's an approach to understanding process where not only where the researcher is studying with the world that they're looking at. So these are the four perspectives that I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to take them one by one and just give some examples. And we'll look at two of them, and then we'll have a little break, and then we'll look at the other two after the break, after some questions. Okay, just to let you to acknowledge my co-authors. So these ideas were developed with Maud Brunet and Fernando Fachin. Maud is assistant professor at AGC Montreal, and Fernando Fachin is at the Royal Military College of Canada. And we have a paper which is just about to come out in the International Journal of Project Management, which talks about some of these ideas. So if we take first perspective, process as evolution, here the focus is on how an entity evolves and is transformed over time. And typically, so here I have this diagram, which comes from one of my articles, which illustrates the difference between variance theory and process theory. And on the left, you have a variance theory where a dependent variable is expressed as a function of independent variables. And on the right, you have a different form of explanation where you see that we're looking at the flow over time. So the process as evolution perspective is very much associated with this idea of flow over time, and explaining something in terms of the events, activities, and choices that take place. And typically, what comes out of this is what you might call a process model, usually with lots of arrows and a kind of time going from left to right. And here is an example of a very famous process model in strategy. Those of you who are in strategy have certainly come across this model by Robert Bergelman, published in Initiative Science Quarterly quite a long time ago in 1983. And he was interested in how firms allocate resources to new ventures. And you can see that there are 4 stages in which different actors are involved in trying to persuade other people about the need to adopt new technology and so on. And so there's a flow over time. In order to do a study like that, though, there are certain methodological requirements. So we're now going to look at some of the methodological aspects of this. So in order to study process this way, the type of research design and data that you need is longitudinal case studies, very much. These are very important. And often data from multiple sources, so interviews, observations, archives, etc. Quite often over long periods of time, can depend on the rhythm of the process that you're looking at. What then are the analysis tools that you use to do this and to do this kind of study? So based on all these sources of information, a typical way of proceeding is to develop a unified temporal narrative of what happened and what happened next and what happened next. And in an earlier paper, I developed a couple of approaches to analyzing this kind of data, which is temporal bracketing and visual mapping. So temporal bracketing is kind of decomposing your process into temporal chunks to compare them. And visual mapping is drawing your data. And these are kind of classic approaches to doing process research of this kind. And okay, what are some of the conceptual tools that you might want to use for this? So I am quoting here Andrew Van der Ven and Marshall Scott Poole, who wrote a really famous article about different forms of process theorizing. And they identified 4 different models. The first one is a life cycle model where things are deterministically evolving over time. A second one is a teleological model. Excuse me, just one moment. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I have a meeting. I can't. Okay, thank you. Yeah. I apologize, a little interruption. I'm back. Okay, so we were talking about Andrew Van der Ven and Scott Poole's conceptual models. So there's the life cycle model, the teleological model, which is about learning, an ecological model, which is about the survival of the fittest. So that's another kind of model that can be used for this, and dialectical theories, where elements confront each other and produce a different result. So these provide a range of theoretical tools that you can apply to this kind of work. You can mix and match them in different ways. I'm just showing here a very recent example of a study that used this approach, and we just had this accepted, this paper with 3 colleagues on, it's about social mission-driven organizations and how they maintain support from their stakeholders over time. And Saouré Kwame collected data over about 20 years to do this study. We saw that over various episodes, the organization engaged in what we call emotional resonance work to try and ensure that the organization's mission continued to resonate with stakeholders. And it was a philanthropic organization, so that was particularly important. It was important that stakeholders believe in the mission of the organization and its identity. So they engaged in these different efforts, succeeded in developing emotional resonance, but that tended to dissipate over time. So in order to maintain it, they had to repeat these processes over and over again. So this illustrates, and so then the next slide shows how this plays out over time. And you can see the idea of temporal bracketing here. So over the 20 years, we looked at what happened in the first episode between 1996 and 2007 and how these processes took place. We saw that the same kinds of things took place between 2008, 2012, but there was an element missing during that period. And so they were less successful. And then we have a third period where they were engaging in similar practices and were able to renew emotional resonance with their mission from their stakeholders. And so you can really see the temporal bracketing across time in this slide. And you can also see, well, it's a visual map, right? It shows you with both boxes and arrows how this works out. So you can see our analytical tools taking place in this. You can also see different levels of analysis on the left-hand side. So that's a typical processes evolution study that we've just completed on this process. So what are, okay, I'm going to skip this one because we may not have enough time. So what are some of the problems, the dilemmas and limitations of doing process research this way? Well, first of all, It's usually quite demanding, collecting and integrating huge amounts of data across space and time. I mean, the example I gave you is exceptional, over 20 years, but quite often for important changes to occur in organizations, and if you're looking at the organizational level of analysis, which we were, it does require long periods of data collection. And you end up with one story, monological account. So you don't see the different ways of understanding what is going on. So it's one single story. The very interesting thing about the paper I just showed you is that the version I just showed you is the third version. It was submitted to Academy of Management Journal the first time maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and it was a completely different story at the time. It was revised, and then it was a second completely different story, and then it was revised for a third time, and it was another completely different story. And I sometimes think that it would be very interesting for readers to see the three stories about the same data. It's not that one of them is wrong and the others are right. It is that they are different ways of seeing things. And the final way we found was perhaps more insightful than the other two, which were a little bit less interesting from the reviewer's point of view. But it is certainly true that there are different ways of looking at your data, and you could have more than one story. But usually when you're writing a paper, they expect one, and that's the one that was left at the end. Okay, so that's the process as evolution perspective. I'm now going to talk about the process as narrative perspective. So how people make sense in narrative accounts. So process here is expressed in the account, not so much in the empirical traces. And so here, your research design and data may be quite different. So you will, well, you could be using interviews in the first case as well, but here you're treating interviews differently. You're looking at interviews in which people are making sense of the past, present, and future. So they are telling their own story. It doesn't mean that that story is necessarily true, although it may reflect their understanding of reality. So it's some sense making going on. Another source of data for using this narrative approach are texts that include narrative or textual representations. So you often see in strategic plans, for example, a narrative being developed, which sort of shows how the organization is constructing the link between the past, present, and the future in their story. So this is really ontologically quite a different way of looking at process. And then what can you do with those narratives? Well, you can compare them across different sources. You can compare narratives across time as well. And narratives, what this does is it emphasizes the multiplicity. So whereas the first approach, you end up with one basic process story, here your raw material tends to provide you with different stories. And the trick is to understand how they interact, how they, what they mean, and what they're actually doing, these narratives. So typical conceptual tools are a bit different. So sense-making theory, framing theory from social movements work, and discourse analysis, because what you're looking at is how people are using language in order to frame processes. So I have a couple of examples here of the ways in which people might use narrative. These examples are from project management research, and I found them quite interesting because they reveal two particular ways of using narrative. The first one, this is a paper by Marshall and Bresnan in International Journal of Project Management, and they tell the story of Brunel's Thames Tunnel and the project narratives for explaining what happened. And actually, they come up with 5 different narratives, each one placing emphasis on different aspects. So one of them is a technical, rational narrative, which takes all the project management tools and shows how they set objectives and they planned and so on. The second one is about the everyday practices that people engaged in during the project. A third one is about how particular individuals, for example, influenced the project and how that was part of their careers. A third one is about the politics of the project. And so each of these stories kind of places a different light on what happened. It's not that they're incorrect. They all have value, but none of them can cover everything that took place, and each lens throws light on different things. So an interesting perspective that you can get with a narrative approach is to see the multiple meanings that process might have, and to draw out. You don't need necessarily to integrate those things. They can still help you see different things. A second perspective I think is really interesting, and usefulness of a narrative approach is to look at how the stories people tell are not just a reflection of their understanding of the past. They can also be used to make things happen. So they do things. And by telling a story, you can make that story, in a sense, come true. So this paper by Eninga and van der Lucht is really interesting, and they tell this story in the paper. And it's about how the project director of the Amsterdam Arena talked about inviting the Queen to the opening of the project. And they say, and this guy had construction supervisors who ran into problems when one job turned out to be very, very difficult. They kept buying time, wanting to move the completion date further and further away. So then the manager said, guys, tomorrow I'm sending the invitation to Her Majesty the Queen to open the arena building. And he really did. And so the idea is that by telling this story, you are able to make people do things, in this case, accelerate the project, so that a narrative is not simply a reflection of the past, it is performative. It can make that past happen. And so strategic management stories, for example, strategic plans, can really play that role. It's a story about how the past leads to the present and how it's going to lead to the future. And just by telling it, you may be able to instill some kind of change in what happens. So here are two quite interesting features of the process as narrative approach: the multiple meanings and the performative nature, which you don't see so much with the process as evolution perspective. Just to finish this, I'm going to tell you about one of my own studies, which I really love a lot. This is called, we call this the Ghost Project. And a ghost here is a deceased CEO. And our study is about how the founder figure is invoked in organizational communications to construct organizational identity through changing times. So Joel Basque and I had access to the archives of a large Canadian cooperative organization This archive is an 80-year, goes on for 80 years. It's a magazine, the Revue des Jardins, which came out sometimes once every month, sometimes every 3 months. There are about 600 issues of this magazine between 1935 and 2015. And we have every single issue, and they're digitalized. And it's a magazine which is sent to the officers and employees of the firm, which is a cooperative bank. And by looking at this archive, we were able to see that the CEOs of this organization continually cited the founder. They told stories continually about the founder. And what is interesting is to see how they changed over time. So we call these invocations. And so I'll just show you a few. So here is what we call a conservative invocation of the founder, and it tells a story which is a conservative story in the sense it's promoting the fact that we should not change. Okay, we should stay with the perspective the founder gave us. The founder, by the way, died in 1920. So this is in 1953. This is the current CEO saying, be careful not to be pulled in a false direction and lose the spirit that the founder wanted to give the case. This is the bank branches. Mr. Desjardins never ceased to say that the Caisse Populaire must be parish organizations. He repeated it everywhere. This teaching, which is our strength and security. In other words, we cannot change. The founder told us what we should do, and we have to remain faithful to the founder. So this is a conservative invocation. And so he died in 1920, and this kind of continued until the 1960s, this kind of discourse, the narratives, we can't change. We mustn't change, because if we do, we will not be faithful to the mission that we were given. And then in 1972, this kind of story began to appear. So we call this a progressive invocation. And you can see the tone has changed. It has been said of Alphonse Desjardins, this is the founder, that he knew exactly what to keep, what to change, and as needed, what to innovate. It has also been said of him that he knew how to remind his collaborators of the social duty of adaptation, as well as of the democratic demands of cooperation. So now you can see that they're using him in a different way. He is now a role model. He is an innovator, and we must be an innovator so we can be like him. And so you can see that the narrative is actually constructing the future of the organization in a very different way, but in both instances, they are keeping Mr. Desjardins as the inspiration for their strategy. Once, in the first case, to stay the same, in the second case, to change. It's a really interesting perspective. And just the final one, this is a picture. It's on the front cover of the magazine in 2008, so we're much later. And at the bottom it says en route, which means towards 2012, and you can see the man himself, Alphonse Desjardins, this huge image on the wall. And the group of people underneath it are all the officers and managers of the bank. And you can see that he is pointing the way towards 2012. So we can see how important the image of this individual is to the nature and identity of this organization and moving them ahead. So this is an example of how a narrative perspective based on language essentially might work. And it's a lot of fun. Yeah, I think I'm going to skip this because we've taken too much time. So we have talked about two different perspectives on process. So process as evolution and process as narrative. And I thought I would just pause here and see whether there would be any questions or elements for discussion before I carry on and talk about other perspectives. So I'm just going to, maybe I will stop the sharing because it might be nicer to see you. And
we already have first hand raised.
Okay. All right, Hung.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the first part of your presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, thank you.
Yes, my question is, I have the impression that, no, it's not the impression. It's true that you have a lot of access to data. But as a young scholar, we for a process study, we also have no full package of access of the data. So yeah, I know that you talk about temporal and predicate of data, but is it any solution when we cannot have the whole process of data, but we still want to talk about process?
Yeah, so you know, for example, that 20-year archive that I had for our study, that's exceptional. Very often, process studies, especially the process as evolution type, can be based on archival data. So you don't actually have to be there necessarily. If you can find records which trace events over time. So they could be minutes of meetings, you know, things that were created at the time. Minutes of meetings could be a very useful source for retrospective studies. You can also use interviews. The only thing I would say is if you want to use interviews, you can use interviews to talk about events, but people don't have excellent memories of chronology. So if you're using interviews for things like that, you need to have lots of them, and you need to try and triangulate them with other sources all the time. So I mean, I have done interview studies with maybe processes that were kind of 5 years old, and then you can check with meeting minutes that actually the things that people are telling you about did actually happen. The other thing that you want to be careful with is about interviews is it's very different. You know, people may tell you about events, and those events will enable them to it will raise memories about how they felt at the time. But when people are talking about emotions that they felt 5 years ago, I think you have to be very careful about that. I'm not sure that people can really remember that well. They may exaggerate them a little bit or remember them differently. So that can be a problem. But the more you can get data that was created at the time, the better it is. And there's more and more of that kind of thing available. Just think about emails. What is your, how many years worth of emails do you have on your computer? My husband gets rid of his emails after a week, but I can't do that. I must have years worth of records, and many people do. And that can be quite useful if people are willing to share. They may not share everything, but they might be willing to share some things that they have. So that's one answer. There are lots of questions.
Thank you so much.
I'm not sure who is next, but in my top left corner, it's Virginia, who I know.
Hello, Professor. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks for your insight. Actually, I think the temporal blocks, strategy is very useful when I analyze the process data. But I have a confusion about it because I don't know whether I should choose the practical event to divide my data into different steps, or I should the existing constructs should be given the priority when I decide the different blocks. So what's your suggestions?
So personally, I think it's a good idea to separate temporal blocks by events. So an event that really changes the dynamics of what's going on. And you cannot tell until you see it. Very often I have found that, in an organization, it's when there's a new leader, it changes the dynamics of what's going on. And it may, or a new set of people may change the dynamics in a quite a radical way, and that very often serves as the way to break things down. I would be a little bit suspicious of pre-developed models, like of decision making. So there's intelligence, there's design, and there's choice and evaluation. My experience with that is the model usually doesn't fit, because these models have been developed often as normative models, as prescriptive models. You should do X, Y, and Z, but people don't do that. They do something different. And if you're doing an empirical process study, you want to see what people actually do, not what you can maybe squeeze your stuff into the a priori constructs, but I think that is betraying the data. So I would tend not to do that. I think Sebastian was next, but I'm not sure. I saw your hand up early.
Also, I'm not sure if I was next, but I have a very kind of a specific question. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the process tracing method, the qualitative process tracing. I think Derek Beach and Peterson and Gehring are working with this, and it comes more from a political science perspective. Would you argue that you can still use it in the business area as well, because it's really trying to very focused to trace the processes between causal mechanisms in a very detailed way? Would you argue that it's possible to?
I am slightly familiar with it. I'm not all that familiar with it, but I think it certainly has potential to be used in the business context. I have seen, the books, but I haven't gotten fully into them. Mm-hmm. But certainly you would have to justify it. But I think that it's certainly a useful approach. Yes.
I mean, that's always the question. How do you justify something?
Well, I'm sure that in the books themselves, they justify the particular focus on mechanisms, right?
Exactly.
Look at. So I think that that can be done. I'm trying to see whether there are people who have actually used it in business, and I'm not absolutely sure. But there's a paper in ASQ that uses. Send me an email, okay? And
thank you very much. I'll send you an email.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Okay, so listen, I'm going to go to the top left-hand corner of my screen, and it's Virginia Rosales.
Hi, Anne. Good to see you.
Yes.
So my question was about process narratives, because I'm now starting to analyze data, so field notes from observations, where doctors are explaining me their thought processes of how they move from symptoms to diagnosis. So I was wondering, because you talk about interviews or text as data, but I was wondering, how do you take, the kind of verbalization of how they're thinking or how they're moving from A to B? Do you take as a narrative, or do you take it? Would it be more in line with the process of activity approach?
I think you could take it as a narrative if they are telling you what they did, and they're not doing it. You're not observing them doing it. They're just telling you. They're telling you the story, and
the thing.
Yes, go ahead.
Because I'm following them, but at the same time, they are getting the lab results. So then they explain, okay, I have this value here, and this means this. So if they wouldn't explain that, I wouldn't be able to interpret it myself. So it's like I'm getting I'm observing what they do, but the narrative is kind of adding to the explanation of the action. So it's a bit in between, I would say.
You're
right?
actually, yes, it's a bit in between. You're seeing that sense making in action, I guess.
Yeah.
So a sense making approach would probably be appropriate, I would think. Yeah.
Okay.
But it's possible that some studies might be in between. This looks like one. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anoop?
Hi, Anne. Good to see you. Thanks for the introduction. I mean, it's a sort of almost going back in the years kind of question. How did you discover process research, Anne?
Well, I was doing it without knowing it for a long time. Yeah. So I was working with Henry Mintzberg, who was very interested in qualitative research, and working with students also. And one of the students I was working with was Jean Truex. He was a master's student, and he was very worried about this approach. He thought that, you know, we don't have a dependent variable and an independent variable. Well, this is not right. And he showed me a book he had found by Lawrence Moore about organization theory. And he said, this is what we're doing. This is a process approach. And in that book, it's a 1982 book about organization theory by Lawrence Moore. Lawrence Moore compares variance theory with process theory. And then you know, we had a discussion with Jean, you know, this is what we're doing. But we did it first, and then we asked ourselves, what is this thing? And it was Lawrence Moore who was the inspiration. So there you go.
Thank you.
Emily?
Hi, Anne. Your work has been very influential to me. And I just, as we're going through this, in the current research that I'm doing, I found myself using multiple approaches to process theory, and it seems, you know, to work. Like, you go in, you identify these triggers, more activities. You go out, you do interviews, and you know, you get their sense making. And if I'm studying language and you know, action and cognition over time, is that okay? Is that acceptable in your eyes to talk about? You know, I've done temporal bracketing to get the big picture over time, but I've also, you know, got some of the mechanisms from the interviews and that sense making process.
Yeah, so when you're looking at interview, I think it's okay, but I think that you want to be careful when you're using interviews to understand what it is that you are getting from it. So are you using them to tell you what happened? Or are you using them to tell you what people made sense of? That's a different thing. This is more about their cognitions. Or are you using them to see what people were claiming or trying to make you think? Or, you know, is it impression management? So I think you need to be very clear in your mind, okay, why am I using these interviews? What is my focus? So if you're using a kind of a Joya approach, which is the interpretive study, then, you know, I think that you could be pretty consistent in looking at this over time and consider this as cognitions and as understanding. So if you're looking at identity, you're looking at people's understandings over time. I think that that's okay. I think that's fine. It's just important to be clear about what you're doing. I think.
So even if we're using both interviews, but we started out with archival data, maybe just to specify which type of lens we're taking and looking at that data.
So. Yes,
okay.
Epistemologically, yeah.
Thank you.
So I have Ekaterina.
Yes, so first, Anne, thank you very much for this very helpful presentation, and I look forward to hearing more about process research studies. So my question, yes, is about if it's possible ever to claim that you are doing process research study and process theorizing if you have a case that there are multiple individuals that work on the same project, but they are separated geographically and not necessarily communicate a lot with each other. But you, as a researcher, you can make interviews. Probably you are invited to some of the meetings, but they also do not have like this face-to-face interaction because they are in different, they're in different countries. And is it possible to claim that? Because I'm as a researcher, I also do not have access to their emails to really make a judgment, about this communication between.
So I mean, yes, I mean, I think you could do, especially if they're not working face to face themselves, that's quite interesting. But maybe you have series of interviews, series of interviews with the same people over time, so you can see how their narratives change over time. That would be a good approach, I think, so that you have waves of interviews, and then you can really look at the temporal nature of what they're doing, so they can talk retrospectively, but then you've also got some change over time. So that would be my recommendation if you wanted to do that.
Okay, so if I'm not really like participating and observing what they are doing and how they are doing, because physically, it's hard to be in different places. So the interviews could be a solution, but
that could be a solution. I mean, you probably need quite a lot so that you can triangulate what they're saying, so that you can see that they're talking about similar things and judging them in different ways. So interviews are they have all kinds of, an individual interview has all kinds of defects, but if you have lots of them, then you can get past that, I think. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
So I'm not sure whether I'm doing this in the right order, but we have Hale Shimi.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor. So my question is regarding the process as narratives. I would like to know, what are the limitations of this approach? Are they the same as the first approach, process as evolution, or there are different limitations for this approach?
Well, if you're using a process as narrative approach, it's a choice. You will not necessarily know what really happened. You will have the stories. You will be relying on the stories. And if you have multiple stories, it may be difficult to reconcile them. They may, the different people may be telling you different things. How do you try and analyze that so that it makes sense? So that can be an issue. Sometimes with a narrative approach, if all you have is narrative, the reviewers of a paper might tell you, yes, but you don't really know what the effect of this was, because you don't have the outcome, or you don't have the so for example, with our story about the founder of the bank, we don't know how people receive these stories. All we know is this is what they said in this archive, but and because it's all old stuff, we have no idea how people receive that. And did they believe what the CEOs told them? We don't know, because it's just a story that was told in it. So that can be one of the downsides of that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
I think Samuel was next. Bangang Tang. Hello, Samuel.
Hi, Anne. Good to see you. Thank you for your presentation. My question is about the role inspiration played versus induction. By induction, I mean data-driven discovery. So my question is about the role inspiration plays in conducting the, the narrative-oriented studies. For example, as you shared with us your co-authored paper with Basque, the Ghost Project, the banker, because to me, I immediately think of kind of Jesus. Because in the Bible there are kind of seemingly contradictory remarks by Jesus, and then after decades, or not decades, 1,000 years, people can interpret his remarks from different angles. So my question, just one example, because people can approach a process from different narratives. So my question is, how much the role of inspiration? Because if I jump into conclusion that, okay, and if I were Basque, and let's approach this from this narrative, they all want to kind of enact the banker as the founder banker as a kind of icon. So that's something we cannot touch. So whatever he said, even in 1920s, is correct. So we have to make sense of it. We have to propagate that to the public. But maybe in doing so, we might have missed the nuances in this, because according to the multi-universe theory, which is from the physicist Morse, there should be different kind of realities, in quotation marks, realities. And then, so this is my question: what is the role of inspiration?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're inspired by who you are, your own experience, that makes you see things in different ways, and working with other people also helps your inspiration. I mean, that it's entirely clear, and I think that any research is, and quantitative research is the same. It's not, it's not a mechanical exercise. So at some point, there's something that comes from outside the actual data which inspires you, or you notice something and you think that's interesting. We saw that they were quoting the founder all the time, and we thought that's interesting. This in 2012, when the man died, 2008, when the man died in 1920, and they're still calling on him as an inspiration for their cooperative philosophy, it's quite remarkable. And it's remarkable also because many organizations don't call on their founders. I mean, I work at HEC Montreal, and most of my colleagues wouldn't even know who the founder was. So, what's going on? And there's something about that, which is quite interesting. So yeah, we were inspired to see that. Another thing which is inspirational about this case that we've been looking at is how over time, it's a cooperative bank. In order to succeed in the market, it's become more and more like a non-cooperative bank. So the cooperative philosophy is gradually disappearing, really. I mean, it's becoming closer and closer to any old bank. And yet, they still have this identity, which is we are not a bank. We are a cooperative, which is something different. And even they had an advertising campaign in the early 2000s, which the title was, the slogan was, "This is not a bank." And yet it was becoming closer and closer and closer to being everything that a bank is. And so how do you explain and how they managed to sustain that? So but it's, yeah, and you get attracted to things which kind of echo somehow with your experience. So Hannah.
And thank you so much for your presentation. I'm looking at how organizations select their transnational strategic alliances. And I'm doing this through the research questions of why, basically, why are they choosing them, how they're doing this, and what their outcomes are. And I'm just wondering, whether it's sufficient to have these temporal brackets as, you know, what types of conversations and discourses and debates happened before the selection, after they made the decision which alliances they had chosen, and then what happened after, basically in terms of outcomes. Is that good enough, basically, or how would you see that? I would appreciate any feedback.
I think that's interesting, because you're looking at what happens before, and then you have the events, and then you have the outcomes. I think to make it into a process study, I would ask myself, well, how did the outcome affect the next decision? And so that you would then have a more of a process view. So that they are learning, for example, they might be learning over time, or they might be evaluating their previous experience and then saying, okay, well, better not do that again. And so I think that what would make it more of a process study is if as if you followed over time. But you don't have to do that, of course. There's nothing wrong with not doing that. It's just that I think that would be an interesting question in terms of alliances, how they build their alliance network over time based on, you know, subsequent decisions and events and so on.
I think that would be really helpful if it was a longitudinal study, which is not what I'm doing, unfortunately. Because I'm looking at higher education institutions as organizations, it's, you know, it's not like they're having, you know, sessions where they're evaluating things and then saying, okay, we've, you know, achieved something or haven't achieved something, so we're doing something else. So if we don't take that next step, then it's not a process study. Is that what I'm understanding?
Unless you're looking at the process of decision making itself, and maybe that's what you're looking at, and you would have you would be analyzing the processing, the process that you're looking at would be the decision process and how they arrive at those decisions. Then in that case, I think it would be a process study. Yeah, it could be. But if you're just interested in the antecedents and the outcomes, no.
Oh no, I think decision making. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. Okay. So if I make these into 3 chunks, then that's a process study too.
Well, I mean, the middle chunk might need to be, you know, unpacked. Yeah, in order for it to be a process. Otherwise, you can classify it in a process like this, a process like that, a process like the other thing, and it becomes a variable very quickly. So if it's more than, you know, if you're turning the process of decision making into a variable, then it's not a process study for me. Yeah. So you would want to know the actual events and the decision making, what they did first, how they proceeded, etc., for it to be a process study. But that's what I would say. Okay. Alex?
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Very interesting, very impressive presentation, and very helpful for my current study. I'm conducting a single case study about a firm covering 30 years of its development. And I interview 3 employees, and then I go back, collect the data, archive data. After a year, I interview about 15 workers in this firm. But my question is, I didn't design a longitudinal research method, but I conduct this kind of work. Can I claim I used a longitudinal study in my paper? That's my question.
Well, it's not longitudinal. It could be historical. I mean, if it's retrospective, I wouldn't call it longitudinal. I would call it a retrospective historical study.
Okay.
If you're looking backward from today, and basically the interviews are kind of tracing back, and I mean, if it's got data that was created at the time, so it's real archives, then, but I would call it more historical.
Historical.
No, you didn't follow it through time, so I would call it historical, and that's good. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that.
Okay, I see. I see. Thank you very much.
Okay, Sebastian. You're muted, I think.
Ah, there we go. You gotta love technology. Too many buttons on the headset. First off, I want to echo my thanks for taking the time to share your knowledge of process with all of us. And I just wanted to ask a question to clarify one point from the process evolution as evolution perspective that you mentioned earlier. So from my very limited understanding of process and substance philosophy, it appears that they both hold kind of divergent ontological views in regards to how the world is constituted, right? So with process as evolution, are you saying that even those researchers whose studies are based in substance metaphysics can kind of tap into the process of becoming through the methodological designs that they choose, i.e. the longitudinal design with multiple sources, looking at that changes? Is that accurate?
I'm basically saying that most people who do that are, if you were to ask a process philosopher whether they were adopting a process ontology, their answer would probably be no. Because they are looking at how things evolve over time, with the thing being an entity, and they would say that you're not actually adopting a process ontology. I don't really worry about that too much. I think you're still doing something really interesting by incorporating time into your study. And that's really important. And there are kind of degrees to which people are able or not to develop a process ontology. And I think it's almost impossible to do research with a pure process ontology, because we don't even have language to talk about the world without using nouns, But I would say that people who adopt a process as evolution, or you could say development over time perspective, are probably thinking more in terms of substances that change than in terms of the constitution of the world as being processual. So, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
So I have Susanna and then Daniel.
Yeah. Hi, and I'm thinking Daniel was before me, but
okay. I'm sort of going to my top left-hand corner, and
yeah, because I just raised my hand in the second, but and I thought it may be not so fair, but I will then steal the spot because he just showed me. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much for the very insightful presentation. I really enjoyed it, and it's super helpful to learn from you. So I'm trying to also leverage now the opportunity to have your input on a dilemma that I have with respect to one of my own dissertation projects, where we are trying to study a company, and it is a longitudinal case, I would say, but so just a little bit of context, we are following the company from 2017 up until now, and we have interviews with them actively about the current, basically progression of events that are happening at the company. But we use and leverage some of the interviews also to retrospectively trace back events up until 2013. And we have also some kind of archival data about these events, tracing them back. But can we still then kind of claim that we are capturing longitudinally, or this is also somehow relating to other people's questions, longitudinally the case from 2013, or would that be, a little bit of a stretch?
I mean, I would say that you've got a retrospective study up to 2013 and then longitudinal from then on. That's okay. So that 20-year thing that I told you about, we had two data collectors there, I think the first, I would say 5 years were retrospective, and then we had a observational period, and then there was nothing except archives, and then we had another observational period. So it's partly longitudinal, partly historical.
Okay, that's super helpful. Thank you so much.
No, at last.
Hi, Anne. Thank you so much for your time and information and willingness to share with so many junior scholars around the world. I have a question less about doing process research, more of discussing process meta-theoretically. You have your SAGE handbook from a few years ago. There's the SAGE handbook on process philosophy. There's the prose series of books. Are there other outlets or recent publications perhaps that you're familiar with that keep up on the debate, more methodologically and philosophically that we could look into?
I mean, I think that the SAGE handbook is probably the latest piece that really does a kind of overview. And in that handbook, there are several chapters on methodology. There are several chapters relating process research to substantive issues. So there'd be one on technology, on communication, on a variety of different topics, and looking at them processually. So for me, this is, the Bible as far as at this point. And the SAGE handbook of, no, it's not, it's Oxford Handbook of Process Philosophy is more, if you're into going back to the first principles of process philosophy, that would be the place to go. I find that I'm more of a methodologist and a very pragmatic one, and so I tend not to engage so much with the process philosophical perspective, but that's where you should go, definitely. Other work you might look at is Tor Helnes, who has written a book on process and organizing, which I think is a really good book, and probably you would find useful. And, come to PROS, and that's where it happens. The PROS conference, if those of you who don't know about it, the International Symposium on Process Organization Studies, is held every year on a Greek island. Last year, the Greek island was Zoom, but next year, hopefully it'll be Rhodes in June. And if you're interested, we require a 1,000-word abstract for the end of January. And it's a small conference, but it's focused uniquely on process organization studies. And next year it's with Marc Durand and Gail Whiteman, and the theme, I think it's very appropriate theme for the times. It's about extreme contexts. But you don't have to have a paper on extreme contexts. If it's processual in any way, shape, or form, you're welcome to submit to the conference.
Thank you.
So I think maybe we should, Brat, are you there?
Yes, Anne. Shall we carry on with the presentation?
Carry on with the presentation? Okay, so I will share my screen again. Okay. All right, so I was going to talk about the other two perspectives. So let's start. Okay, we are. So let's move on to the process as activity perspective, which I argue adopts a becoming ontology. And the focus here is on how a phenomenon is shaped and constituted through activity. So it's an approach which takes a much stronger process-based ontology with a kind of an assumption that the world is made up of processes. So the type of research design and data that you would tend to use for this kind of perspective is naturally occurring observations, real-time activity and interactions, because you want to capture how phenomena are being constituted in the moment. So it's the study of processes in the moment. So things like ethnography, email data, conversations, meetings, very fine-grained data are what enable you to do this kind of work. In terms of analytical tools, what tends to happen is that in a paper, you can only look at a very, very small amount of data because you need to have it very fine-grained. So the typical approach is, which I call the deep dive vignette, into interaction and activity episodes, where you can really see the phenomenon occurring in the moment. And you might compare multiple micro events over time where you can see these interactions occur. Some of the conceptual tools, practice theory. So Davide Nicolini's work is really worth examining. Scholars who favor strategy as practice approach would certainly be worth looking at. So Paula Jaszkowski and Richard Whittington's work. And recently there's been some work by Tom Lawrence and Nelson Phillips, which I kind of associate with the process activity perspective. They call it the social symbolic work perspective. So I don't know if you've noticed this, but there's recently been a trend where people take a noun and they put the word work next to it. So identity work, institutional work, emotional work, strategy work, technological work, legitimacy work, whatever. And the notion is basically that these are abstract concepts that people work on. So the focus is on what they do. So identity work, for example, is the effort people place on constructing their identity. You can have organizational identity work, which is the work people engage in to construct an organizational identity. So Lawrence and Phillips recently published this book about social symbolic work, which really takes all these versions of something work and pulls them together in a kind of a treatise, which really, from my perspective, is close to a process activity perspective. So some examples. So here's an example. This is a paper which really shows the nature of the deep dive vignette. So this is a paper by Robin Thomas, Lisa Sargent, and Cynthia Hardy in organization science. And they're showing how conversations between top and middle managers can give rise to shared meanings or not. And so what they basically do is they compare two very detailed conversations, and they show how in one case, people build on each other, and there is some kind of negotiation going on. And they show this in micro detail. And so this is the conversation, the back and forth that takes place in one of these conversations, where at the end of the conversation, you can see that they have come to some kind of negotiated settlement over what the strategy is about. And then they show you an alternate conversation where it seems that the top management is saying one thing, the middle management is saying another, and they fail to connect. And so the study really shows what it is about the conversation and the way that people react to each other that generates these things in the moment. And so really it is process as activity and how shared meaning is constituted through the very conversations that are taking place. I have another example, which is from some of my own work with Maria Luciani, who is at in Venice. And this is a paper in 2019, The Social Construction of Strategic Coherence. and published in Long Range Planning. And this is based on her thesis. And she was interested in, she was studying a strategic planning process in this hospital. And surprisingly to us, it seemed as if, in spite of the fact that this is a pluralistic organization where people are doing different things, it was surprising to us that at the end, it seemed as though everything that people wanted to do was coherent. And so what we show is how this happened. And they had a planning office, and they had a strategic plan. And we looked at the conversations between clinicians and the people in the planning office, and how, and you can see this at the bottom here, how the narrative, the original narrative from the clinician about what they wanted to do got transformed through the conversation into this little spreadsheet output on the right, okay, where everything was, okay, so you had to have an analysis of the existing situation. They had these little categories, and they managed to insert them into a spreadsheet. So that was one way that this coherence started to work. And then there was another conversation where all of the top managers were meeting. They had the spreadsheet, and they went through each line in the spreadsheet and merged some of the lines and separated out some of the lines. And at the end of it, everything appeared to be coherent with the original strategic plan. So there's a kind of a massaging process that takes place so that symbolically, at the end of all this, they perform strategic coherence, in spite of the fact that you could argue that all of these little projects at the origin of that were not coherent at all, but they were generated as being so through these conversations with positive feeling among members of the organization. So that's another example of where the focus is on activity. And in the paper, when we talk about deep dive vignettes, we really have these detailed vignettes of two projects that get massaged in this way. So one of the particular difficulties of this approach is trying to convince your reader that you have picked out, you know, the most powerful examples, and what you're showing is representative of the whole perspective. So that's one of the issues. So the idea that you've got snippets of data in your paper, so what about the rest? That can be a question that you receive. And another issue with this is, because you're focusing on activity and what the activity accomplishes, it may be difficult to distinguish between the activity and what it does. They kind of flow into one another. So here we have activity, things that are people doing, and at the end we say it's performing strategic coherence. But you know, is that's inherent to what they're doing? So there's not a dependent variable and an independent variable. There is doing which constitutes something, and that can be a little bit. Sometimes reviewers find that difficult. So that's a third perspective. And the fourth one, which is called process as withness, takes us even a little bit further along something which is a little bit unfamiliar. So here, the notion is that the researcher themselves is also in motion when you're doing the research. And we were inspired to develop this idea by two authors. The first one is John Schotter, who developed this idea of withness thinking, the idea of the researcher being in motion along with the research. And so the word withness comes from him. And the second inspiration is Carl Weick, and he wrote this paper in 1999 in Journal of Management Inquiry, That's Moving, Theories That Matter. And I'm just going to read you this quote because I think it's really interesting. He says, unsettled, emergent, contingent, living forward contrasts sharply with our backward-oriented theoretical propositions that depict that living as settled, causally connected, and coherent after the fact. So basically he's saying that most of the research we do is we're studying dead things. It's happened and we analyze it. But what practitioners are doing, they're living forward. They need to know what to do next. And so they're forward looking. And why can't researchers also do that? So he says the compact causal structures that epitomize our theories are artifacts of retrospect rather than narratives of prospect. And so he's arguing for a prospective view of research. So you're in movement along with the things you are studying. There's kind of two aspects to this, in fact. There's thinking forward and thinking forward with, so with others. So that these two aspects are present in this notion of withness. So how could you possibly imagine doing this? Yeah, so you're like kind of surfing on the wave, with the wave as it moves. Possible ways of approaching it are action research, so working in real time with people, autoethnography, where you analyze your own experience, forms of engaged scholarship, where you're actually studying with people in real time. Then when you're doing your analysis, you're doing collective sense making with your research participants. So it will be iterative, temporally grounded analysis. And you may have to go back again and again and again, because if you're really studying forward, your evaluation or your analysis today will not be the same as the analysis you would make tomorrow when something else has happened. So you should be doing this repeatedly through time. And conceptual tools, I think any of the tools that we could have considered previously might be useful, but considered prospectively rather than retrospectively, and with others and not after the fact. So you could use any theoretical tool that helps you think, but you need to think forward with it rather than backward with it. So in terms of examples, it's very hard to find examples published in some of the top journals, but here is one which I think approaches the kind of perspective that we're talking about. This is a paper by Lotte Lusche and Marianne Lewis, which is published in Academy of Management Journal. It's an action research study, and they were studying, actually one of the two authors was a consultant working with the organization, which was Lego, to deal with organizational change. And in the paper, they used a paradox perspective to discuss some of the challenges that the organization members were encountering. And the paper basically shows how the authors collaborated with organizations members in developing a joint interpretation of their experiences according to a paradox lens, which enabled them to act on the difficulties they were encountering. So this is the kind of approach that implied by a process as witness perspective. Another example which uses autoethnography. And this is a colleague of mine, Alaric Bourgoin, Nicolas Ben-Cherki, and Sama Faraj, did a study of consultants, actually, and how consultants, the topic was how do consultants gain credibility when actually they don't know anything about, when they go into an organization, they really don't know what they're doing. And so how do they learn to show expertise in this particular situation? And Alaric himself was a consultant, right? And so he was writing notes about his own experience as he was living through it, sort of saying, well, I don't know what to do. I don't have any expertise, but I have to show them that I'm credible. And he recounts his own experience in great detail in the paper. He calls himself Thomas, but actually it's him. You can see his own experiences coming through. So that's another example. Of course, you never escape with these studies the fact that by the time the paper is out, it's retrospective, right? So it's very hard to do this forward. So just as speculative reflection. So I actually wrote this paper in 2001 with Jean-Louis Denis and some colleagues. And it was a study of mergers. And we actually wrote this paragraph. I had read that Wyke paper at that time. It was a longitudinal study. And we'd been studying it for 6 or 7 years. And we said, in summary, these mergers combine multiplication of dimensions of pluralism with removal of some of the key forces of stability that keep pluralistic organizations from collapse. And we said, we do not know how the mergers will turn out in the end, but this is how we see them now. This is as far as we have come in our research journey. Hopefully, as we keep on following events, we will learn more. Indeed, if Wyke was right about the value of real-time research, the record we have set down here and now should one day enable us to increase our understanding when we go back to compare it with what actually happened next. So the idea is that what you write now is just provisional, that any real process doesn't end at the moment you stop collecting data, or you give up because you've just run out of time and you write your paper. More will happen. Unfortunately, we never wrote another paper about that particular process, although we did write a paper on a related process, which is quite different. But the notion is that if you're withness thinking, there's an open-endedness of processes, and that we ought to be able to mobilize that more in our research. So an example of someone who comes close to doing that really is actually Robert Bergelman, and I started with his study in 1983, and I think it was a study of Intel. And he's been studying Intel all his life. And he's written endless papers about that. And I think if you looked at them end to end, you would see that there's process as withness going on in the history of those articles, which each one adds a twist to the one before, because he was being there for so long and seeing them over time. So basically that's my story. I just, got some dilemmas and limitations of this one. So as you're doing this, of course, processes get harder to pin down and more seemingly ephemeral. And the question is, how can you generalize from this? So there's a fading potential for transferability with this approach. And in the end, in any case, retrospect takes over because time flows and it's gone by the time you write your paper. So this is not perfect either. And I just wanted to finish with something I think that goes a little bit in this direction. So I'm an editor of the journal Strategic Organization. And actually, I think we put this announcement on the website about 2 days ago. We have a special issue on impact-driven strategy research for grand challenges, and the editors are Amanda Williams, Gail Whiteman, Judith Walls, Bill Harley, and Glenn Dowell. And it's a special issue that aims to advance research and methodological processes for positively impacting grand challenges. And we're particularly interested in uncommon approaches to combine strategic organization research and impact in rigorous and relevant ways, such as action research, ethnography, field experiments, and cases of scientific activism. And we talk about looking for articles that explicitly propose avenues for addressing the methodological challenges of combining research with impact. So there's a tendency, there's an intention behind this, that we would be able to see examples of research that at the same time look at current issues and that contribute to them in positive ways. So this, the notion of withness is behind that. So yeah, just this concluding comment. So there's more than one way to operationalize process. And as we move from the evolution to process as witness, we move closer to a process-based ontology, but our studies become harder to pin down. And then some questions, well, can you combine these approaches? I think I could probably say yes, but we can discuss that, and question which ones are ultimately most useful. So that's my presentation. Yeah, so this is the same slide. Okay. Right, so I'm gonna shut this down. There.
Thank you, Anne. I think we have about 15 minutes before we need to wrap up. So if it's okay, we'll take some more questions now, Anne.
Okay, yeah, sure. So we had Ava first. Yes. Maybe you didn't recognize your name the way I said it. Okay.
Maybe we could go with Maria if
yes,
needs
Maria.
to sort
Okay,
out the technology.
Hi, Anne. And thanks a million for the presentation. It's fantastic to be able to hear someone speak when I've read your work. So it's lovely to hear the voice and to hear your thoughts. I just have a question, and maybe it's one of those silly questions, but I feel I've reversed into this whole area. So my interest is in how people behave, specifically how they negotiate. And as I did my interviews, I discovered obviously that people negotiate over time. It's not a one-off item, and it evolves and changes over time. And I guess I'm just wondering, I'm not studying necessarily the process, although there is a process to it, and different people negotiate. It's more than one person or more than two people. Different people negotiate at different stages. Would you describe this as process research? It's just that some of what you wrote, kind of that this idea of rippling effects over time, and I've noticed that, the past impacts the present, and the present the future, and the future the present. So, and I've kind of commented on that, but would you describe this as process research, even though it's the study of behavior and how it changes? But
so yes, I would capture that. If you can capture how and why behavior changes, I would call it process research. But it depends whether what you're capturing are they interviews that you have, or is it?
Largely interviews with about 31 people, but I do have documents to support as well.
And is there just one interview for each person, or is it over time?
No, one interview, and it's retrospective. So from what you've said earlier, so they described to me, but there's three parties to the one interview, and I've gotten three parties' perspective in a number of different cases.
Okay.
Yeah. And they described to me at the first point when they start negotiating initially that experience, and then subsequently how they negotiate.
Okay, so if you have three people who are talking to you about the same negotiation, and so you have three perspectives on the same negotiation, and it's retrospective. So I think you could sort of say that that was a process as evolution kind of model. Okay. But let's say you only had one interview.
Yes.
You didn't have the other two. So you can triangulate if you have three. You know, you can see how they fit together. But if there's only one, they're telling you a story. It's a narrative. So then you would analyze the narrative because they're constructing what happened. You don't really know whether that's what happened, but they're constructing it.
Yes.
And that's okay. I mean, you know, as long as you treat it as a narrative, this is the way people talk about negotiations.
Okay.
Rather than this is what happened in negotiation, because you don't know, but this is the way people talk about them. But if you have the three on the same negotiation, then I would say that you can triangulate and you can probably get different perspectives on the same events, which is really interesting.
Yeah. I suppose it is a mix actually. So I have 6 companies where I have the 3 people, but then I also have individuals as well, which I'm conscious that they aren't matched.
Well, maybe you can do something to, if you have 6 trios, maybe I would try and write a paper on those.
Okay.
Maybe without the others, because it really gives you this kind of 3 sides, and it may be enough, you know, to get a really strong paper. Whereas if you bring in the other ones, it kind of confuses the issue a bit.
Okay. Thank you very much.
That's my first reaction. I don't know. But,
okay. Thank you.
And I can read out Arva's question.
Okay, Arva's question. Okay.
I should put it in the chat. The question is, can we investigate a process considering a combination of 2 perspectives, e.g. narrative and evolution?
Yes. Quite often the data allow you that. So for example, if I take the study about the philanthropic organization, the 20-year thing, we had, on the one hand, we had 20 years of events, but we also had some meetings in fine-grained detail. So we could use both of those. Probably in a single paper, you wouldn't want to do that, though. You would probably do the fine-grained in the moment activity perspective in one paper, and you would do the long-term evolution over time in another paper, because it would just be too much realistically. But in a thesis, you could certainly do that, so that you could have the turning points in the moment, and then you can have the broad stretch. Similarly with narrative, narratives are positioned in time, so you can consider narratives and the way they interact as kind of a process as evolution perspective. Arovara has done some really good work using that kind of perspective.
And if I may, a question for myself as well. Given the dynamic and open nature of the phenomenon, I mean, we typically spend maybe, I don't know, a year or 2 collecting data. In your case, one of the papers you published recently, 20 years. But when do you know when to stop?
When do you know when to stop? When the money runs out? I don't know. Yeah, well, it's nice if there's some kind of closure. I mean, if you're studying a project, it might be good the project finished. So if there's some kind of closure, that's good, and you can see at the end. But sometimes there may not be, and so what you study is the process when it ended. And if you can keep going, sometimes you may want to, and you may write things before the end, and then write something a bit later. It's quite possible. So
and because of that, is there space for sort of maybe if you like dynamic theorizing, in that if you collect the data, you start theorizing, and then you continue collecting data, and then you perhaps
so I mean, I
obtain a different perspective.
really believe in programmatic research. So a lot of my career was spent studying the healthcare sector, and so we studied different organizations, but also the same organization at different moments. And so it's kind of continuous. So you may get some money for 3 years, but then you need to renew it for another 3 years. But I mean, at some point there is you need to stop to write your story. And some processes, some types of processes finish more obviously at a particular moment. So if it's a project, the project eventually, hopefully, ends. But we had this paper on escalating indecision. It was about how these 3 hospitals had merged, and they were trying to decide how to reconfigure their organization. And they spent all their time deciding, but they didn't produce a decision. At one point, we gave up waiting and wrote a paper about escalating indecision. So how not to decide.
Thank you.
Ghislaine?
Hi, Professor, and thank you for your excellent presentation. I have a dilemma in my work because I'm trying to understand how a museum that faced a fire accident in 2018 is dealing with the result of this accident and try to rebuild its physical structure and reorganize its activities. So in this case, I can see many things happen in the same time. So I'm having problem to say, what is my case of? Which advice can you give me to see what case I have to focus in? What I can focus in this case on?
It's a tough one. I mean, try things out, you know, and one starting point might be to look at Van der Ven and Pool's 4 kinds of process theories. So they talk about life cycle. Is this a life cycle story? They talk about learning, teleological stories. Is this about doing something, seeing what happens, and then changing? Is this a learning story? Is it a dialectic story? So is the conflict occurring? You know, I think having a series of ideas that you can test. You know, there are other things like images of organization. Gareth Morgan, there are 7 ways of considering organization. Maybe just trying to think about, you know, which one fits best. Also, what's the most surprising thing that you saw, and can you find echoes of that thing elsewhere? I think finding what it's a case of it's useful to see that what you are seeing is not unique, that there is something similar elsewhere, and therefore the phenomenon that you are focusing on has echoes, it has resonance, and it may be from your own experience, it might be from literature where you see something similar happening. So that's just a few ideas. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Julia, then Xavier, and then Samuel. Yeah.
I think there were people before me in the queue.
Okay.
I will let the others go first, Professor.
Okay, so Xavier, maybe?
All right, well, thank you. First, thank you, Anne, and thank you, Ibrat, and seminar organizers. My question to you, Anne, is a bit of a more general nature. I'm curious about your take on the nature of theorizing and the standard that we should, as authors and reviewers, hold for theorizing for these different types of process models that you've described today, for instance. I'm aware and very much admirative of your recent paper with Charlotte Cloutier on different types of process theorizing, but I can't quite match those with what you presented today. So could you give us a bit of insight into
so
what
I wrote
theory
a paper,
comes out of and what form it takes?
So I wrote Xavier is talking about a paper I wrote with Charlotte Cloutier on process theorizing in the journal Organization Theory. And what we did for that paper is we looked at Academy of Management Review and organization studies. And we looked at process theorizing papers that didn't have data. Right, they were not data-based. And so, of course, what I've been talking about today is process theorizing from data. And in the other paper, it was about process theorizing without data, which actually I find more challenging than with data, because data kind of keeps you grounded. I think that the qualities of empirical process theorizing are more obvious. You need to be saying something new, relatively new, needs to make a contribution, provide some understanding that wasn't there before, but it also needs to reflect the data. So empirically, tightly linked to the data. Those two things are quite hard to achieve, however, because novelty and reflection of the data kind of go in opposite directions. One is the pull from the empirics is not new, and the pull from being novel means that it may rise above the data, and so that is quite hard to do with an empirical paper. With a theory paper, you're liberated from the data, but you still have to be able to provide that resonance so that when people read what you're saying, they can say, yes, I've seen that, déjà vu, it makes sense, it does correspond to some kind of reality that I'm familiar with, and that there is a logical consistency as well, internal consistency of your theory. So I don't know if that helps and I quite spontaneously.
Yes, thank you. It's certainly a complex area, but these are certainly helpful starting points. Thank you.
Maybe Julia now.
Just before Julia asks a question, just being conscious of your time, it's 5 minutes to.
Yeah, I really do need to leave in 5 minutes. So yeah.
Professor, thanks. I echo everyone else's appreciation for the session today. Very quickly, going to my question then, reflecting back on your concluding thoughts there, as we move closer to process as activity and process as witness, it's harder to pin down the processes. I wonder if you have thoughts on the language, when we're trying to communicate our process research processually. Even language has its limitations, and I have found it personally quite challenging to try to, recreate in some way on a piece of paper the movement that I saw in my own empirical setting, with language and through language. So if you could just comment on that, thanks.
Yes, I agree. I mean, if you're doing a process as evolution perspective, cause and effect are kind of still quite distinguishable. And but when you get into a process as activity perspective, you start to use new words like constitute, instantiate, you're bringing cause and effect. They're not separate anymore. They are mutually creating one another. And so that would be an interesting study to do, actually, to look at how the language that people use in different kinds of studies and how they express the linkages between concepts, or the intertwinedness of concepts, which starts to get quite deeper in the war. So I don't have an answer to that. I think it would be something interesting to look at. Yeah, so you start to talk about accomplishment instead of effect. You start to talk about ongoing construction and things like that instead of talking about cause and effect.
And even perhaps this pull towards making gerunds, you would start strategizing and competing. And thank you so much, Professor. That's brilliant. Cheers.
Okay. I think we have 2 minutes, Samuel.
Yes, very quick. Okay. Do you have any or what suggestions or caveats would you like to offer to junior scholars who like to do the mixed method research, combining qualitative and quantitative methods? That's my question.
I'm not necessarily, I don't think it's something that I would necessarily recommend to do mixed methods research. At least I would try not to do it in the same study. I think it's fine to do a mixed method thesis with a qualitative paper and a quantitative paper, but to try and combine qualitative and quantitative data in the same, 40-page article is, in my experience, extremely challenging and often catastrophic, because the qualitative reviewers think that the quantitative part should be dropped, and but the qualitative part isn't strong enough, and vice versa, because the challenges of combining the two of them are so hard. So it's fine if you do a strong qualitative paper, a strong quantitative paper in the same thesis, and it's great if you can master both of those. There are challenges in mastering both of those, but if you can do that, that's great. But I find it I like to, as an editor, I like it when we get mixed method studies, but then very often it turns sour because the reviewers have trouble with it.
Okay, thank you. Because they have different ontologies, right?
Yeah.
Ontologies. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you.